Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We have a massive stack of research on the table today, and I have to be honest, looking at the title of this file, I was a little skeptical.
Skeptical? Why is that?
Well, the file says the light in the Dark Ages. And, usually when I hear Dark Ages, I think of a 1,000-year gap in history where humanity just sort of stopped.
Mud, plague, and people hitting each other with metal sticks.
Exactly. It feels like the writers of history just went, okay, Rome fell, and then absolutely nothing important happened until Michelangelo painted a ceiling 1,000 years later. It's the flyover country of history.
And that is the standard narrative, you're right. We tend to view the period from roughly 500 to 1500 AD as a kind of a waiting room for the Renaissance.
Yeah.
It's a long, dark, boring hallway.
Right.
But if you actually dig into these sources, and we have everything here from Augustine's autobiography to, records of Chinese stone tablets, that narrative isn't just incomplete, it's a fabrication.
A fabrication, that is a strong word.
It is, but I think it's accurate. The argument these sources are making is that while the political lights went out in the West, the empire collapsed, the spiritual and actually the intellectual lights were burning brighter than ever in some places. It wasn't a time of stagnation. It was a time of incubation, of preservation and massive unexpected expansion.
So our mission today is to debunk the myth of the Dark Ages.
In a way, yes. But more specifically, we're looking at how a very specific group of people, outsiders, slaves, rebels, and monks, managed to not only preserve civilization, but expand the faith when their entire world was literally collapsing around them.
Which, frankly, feels a little relevant right now.
It feels incredibly relevant. If you've ever felt like the structures of society are shaking or that the world is getting darker or more chaotic, well, these are the people who wrote the playbook on how to navigate it.
Okay.
And the key is, they didn't just survive, they thrived. Their resilience really speaks to us today about how to live faithfully for Christ, day in and day out, no matter what the headlines say.
All right, I'm in. Let's time travel. Where are we starting?
We have to start with the collapse. You can't understand the light without understanding just how pitch black the darkness got. So we are dropping into the 5th century.
The end of Rome.
The end of the world, as far as they were concerned. You have to really put yourself in their shoes. For a citizen in 400 AD, Rome wasn't just a country. It was the structure. It was the internet, the banking system, the police force, and the grocery store, all rolled into one.
The whole system.
The whole system. It was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It had lasted for centuries. It felt eternal.
And then the Visigoths show up?
Alaric and the Visigoths, 410 AD. They sack the city, then the Vandals do it again in 455. The psychological shock of this is in the sources, and it is just palpable.
I can't even imagine.
Jerome, the great scholar who translated the Bible into Latin, he was in Bethlehem when he heard the news. He wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." He was so depressed he couldn't work.
It sounds like a total identity crisis. Imagine if the entire global power grid and the internet just shut down permanently tomorrow. The panic wouldn't just be logistical, it would be existential. Who are we without this?
Precisely. The structure that held their lives together was gone. And naturally, when things go that wrong, people start looking for someone to blame. And the pagans, who were still around, though dwindling, had a very specific target.
Let me guess. The Christians.
Bullseye. Their logic was simple and honestly pretty compelling from their perspective. They said, look, for 1,000 years, we worshipped Jupiter and Mars and Juno, and Rome conquered the world. We switched to this Jesus character for 1 century, and now barbarians are burning our villas.
To be fair, from a PR perspective, that's a tough argument to beat. Make Rome great again implies going back to the old gods.
It does. It was a crisis of faith for the Christians, too. They were asking, if Jesus is Lord, why is his empire burning? They had seen Christianity become the state religion, and now this. And into that massive vacuum of fear and confusion steps Augustine of Hippo.
Now, I know Augustine is a heavyweight, but usually I hear about him in the context of dense theology, predestination, original sin, things like that. I didn't realize he was a crisis manager.
Oh, he was the ultimate crisis manager. He writes his masterpiece, The City of God, specifically to answer this accusation, and he does something intellectually brilliant. He refuses to play the game on their terms.
How so?
He completely reframes reality. He says, essentially, you are mourning the fall of Rome because you thought Rome was the point.
And it wasn't.
No. Augustine argues that from the beginning of time, there have actually been 2 cities being built simultaneously in parallel. The city of man and the city of God.
Okay, unpack that.
The city of man, he says, is built on the love of self even to the contempt of God. It's all about power, glory, domination, earthly peace. Rome is the ultimate expression of the city of man.
And the city of God.
The city of God is built on the love of God, even to the contempt of self. It's the church, the kingdom of heaven, made up of all those who put their trust in God. And here is the kicker. Augustine says the city of man is destined to fall. That is its nature. It's transient. It eats itself.
So when the pagans say Christianity ruined Rome, Augustine says, no, Rome ruined Rome. Earthly kingdoms always fall.
Exactly. He tells the Christians, why are you panicked? Your citizenship isn't Roman. It never was. Your citizenship is in the city of God, and that city cannot be sacked by Visigoths. He essentially says, you've mistaken your earthly address for your eternal home.
But, well, it's comforting, but isn't it also a bit of a cop-out?
A cop-out? How do you mean?
Well, it sounds a little like he's saying, don't worry about the burning building, just focus on heaven.
Yeah.
It feels a bit like spiritual bypassing, ignore the suffering around you because your real home is in the sky.
That's a very common critique, and it's a fair question. But if you read the rest of his work, that's not what he's doing. He's not saying withdraw, he's saying re-anchor.
Re-anchor.
Yes. If your hope is in the stock market or the government or the military, you are going to be crushed when those things shake. But if your anchor is in something eternal, you actually have the stability to stay and help. You don't have to flee the burning building because your soul isn't burning with it.
I see. It's about emotional and spiritual resilience. You can serve the city of man better because you aren't worshiping it.
Precisely. It's the ultimate motivation for daily Christian living in a chaotic world. Your work, your charity, your kindness, it's not to shore up a falling kingdom. It's to give people a glimpse of the eternal one.
Okay, that makes more sense. But Augustine wasn't just fighting this external battle about Rome. The sources point out he was fighting an even bigger war inside the church, the Pelagian controversy.
Yes, this is huge. It really gets to the heart of what the Christian life is all about.
Okay, I saw this name in the notes.
Yeah.
Pelagius.
Mm-hmm.
He was a British monk.
Yeah. Yes. And honestly, if you met Pelagius today, you'd probably really like him. He was disciplined, moral, very serious about holiness, a real straight shooter. He looked at the moral laxity in the church and was appalled.
So what was the beef? They both wanted people to be holy.
The beef was about human nature. It was about how you become holy. Pelagius reads Augustine's autobiography, The Confessions, and he finds this one prayer where Augustine says to God, grant what thou commandest, and then command what thou wilt.
Grant what thou commandest. So,
Right.
God, if you want me to be good, you have to give me the ability to be good.
Right. Augustine is admitting his total dependence. He's saying, I am so broken, so twisted by sin that I can't even obey you unless you first give me the grace to do it.
And Pelagius didn't like that.
He loathed it. He thought it was a fatalistic cop-out. He thought it made people lazy. Pelagius believed that human beings have free will and the natural built-in ability to choose good. He thought, if God commands us to be holy, it must be possible for us to be holy on our own. Otherwise, God is a tyrant.
I have to say, that sounds pretty modern. That's the pull yourself up by your bootstraps gospel. You can do it if you just try hard enough.
Right.
It's the entire self-help industry in a nutshell.
It is incredibly modern. Optimize yourself. Be better. Grind harder. And Augustine looked at that mindset, that whole system of self-reliance, and said, that will kill you.
Why? Trying to be good kills you.
Because eventually you fail. And when you realize you can't be perfect, you either become a hypocrite and pretend you are, or you despair. Augustine argued that we aren't just sick with sin, we are dead in it. That's the doctrine of original sin.
Mm-hmm.
If you tell a dead man to stand up, it doesn't matter how motivating your speech is. He needs a resurrection, not a pep talk.
So Pelagius is the coach yelling, try harder, and Augustine is the doctor saying, you need a heart transplant.
That is a perfect analogy. And Augustine fought this tooth and nail because he knew that if the church adopted Pelagius's view, Christianity would just become another moral code, another weight to carry, another city of man project. But if Augustine is right, then Christianity is about rescue. It's about grace.
And in a world where Rome is falling, try harder is probably the last thing you want to hear.
Exactly. When the lights go out, you don't need a lecture on self-improvement. You need to know that your standing with God relies on His power, not your own. Augustine secured that theology for the West, and it became the bedrock for how the church survived the chaos.
So we have Augustine holding down the intellectual fort in North Africa.
Yeah.
But you mentioned British monk with Pelagius. Let's actually go up north, because the sources have this wild story about a guy named Patrick.
Oh, Patrick. Yes, we have to talk about Patrick.
Oh, we're not talking about green beer and leprechauns.
Please erase the cartoon image from your mind. The real story of Patrick is closer to a Liam Neeson movie than a parade.
That's intense. Let's unpack that.
It is. Patrick was born around 389 AD in Roman Britain. His family was wealthy, they were Romanized Celts. His father was a deacon, his grandfather was a priest, so he was part of the establishment. Patrick grew up with heated floors and servants.
He was a trust fund kid.
Basically. And by his own admission in his writings, he wasn't very religious. He calls himself a nominal Christian. He was just enjoying the good life. And then, at age 16, it all ends. Irish pirates, who were the terror of the seas back then, raid his family's estate.
And they take him.
They kill some of the servants, drag him and others onto a boat, haul him across the Irish Sea, and sell him into slavery in Ireland.
I can't even imagine. One day you're in a villa with every comfort. The next, you're what?
You're a shepherd. He was sent to the west of Ireland, likely County Mayo, to herd sheep. He was cold, hungry, often naked, and completely isolated. He didn't speak the language. He was a nobody. He went from the pinnacle of the city of man to the absolute bottom.
This is the literal definition of Dark Ages.
It is. But here's the pivot. Patrick writes a book called The Confession. It's one of the most remarkable documents from the period. And in it, he says that the cold and the hunger were actually the best things that ever happened to him.
That sounds crazy. How can he possibly say that?
He says, and this is a quote, "The Lord opened the understanding of my unbelief. In the silence of that slavery, stripped of all his comforts and his ego, he finally met God. He says he would pray 100 times a day and 100 times a night. The snow, the frost, the rain, it just drove him closer to Christ."
So he had to lose everything to find the one thing that mattered.
Classic city of God versus city of man. The city of man was stripped away by force, and only then did he find the city of God. It's a powerful illustration of what Augustine was writing about at the very same time.
But he didn't stay a slave.
No. After 6 years, he hears a voice in a dream saying, "Your ship is ready." He takes it as a word from God. He escapes, walks 200 miles to the coast, finds a ship, and somehow talks his way onto it. He eventually makes it back to his family in Britain.
Cue the happy ending. He's home, he's safe, he's never going near Ireland again.
That's what any sane person would do. I survived hell, I'm retiring to the country. But Patrick isn't sane. He's holy. He gets another vision a few years later. He sees a man from Ireland handing him a letter, and he hears the voice of the Irish people crying out, "We ask thee, holy boy, come and walk among us once more."
No way. They enslaved him, they stole his youth, and he's called to go back.
And yet he feels compelled to go back. This is what I mean about the light shining in the darkness. This is radical, illogical forgiveness. It's the gospel in action. He goes back in 432 AD, not as a slave, but as a missionary bishop.
But he wasn't just walking into a neutral situation. The sources mention the Druids. This wasn't just preaching to the choir. This was a full-on spiritual confrontation.
Oh, it was spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
We need to understand the Druids. These weren't just guys in robes hugging trees. They were the power brokers of Irish society. They were the priests, the judges, the scholars. They used magic, superstition, and fear to control the high kings. They claimed to control the weather, the crops, health.
So Patrick shows up and challenges the entire power structure.
Head on. There's a famous story. Some of it is legend, but the core of it is true about the Easter fire. The High King had decreed that on a certain night, all fires in Ireland had to be extinguished until the king lit his ceremonial fire at the Hill of Tara. It was a symbol of his total authority over life and death, light and darkness.
And Patrick
climbs the Hill of Slane right across the valley from Tara, and in direct defiance of the king, he lights a massive paschal fire before the king can light his. It's a fire celebrating the resurrection of Christ.
That's a provocation.
It's a direct challenge. It's saying there is a higher king than the one at Tara. The Druids go crazy. They tell the king, if that fire isn't put out tonight, it will never be extinguished in Ireland.
Prophetic words.
Very. The king goes to confront Patrick, intending to kill him, but instead, Patrick preaches the gospel. And because Patrick had spent 6 years as a slave, he knew their language, he knew their culture, he could explain the Trinity using a shamrock, he knew how to speak to them in a way a Roman outsider never could have.
That is the key insight for me. God didn't waste the suffering. The slavery was his seminary.
Exactly. The darkest moment of his life was the very thing that prepared him for his life's work. If he hadn't been a slave, he couldn't have been the apostle to Ireland. He converted the tribal chiefs, and because the society was tribal, when the chief converted, the clan followed. He didn't just save souls, he ended the slave trade in Ireland. He changed the entire civilization.
It's incredible. You have Augustine using his intellect to say the software of the faith, and Patrick using his life experience to install it in new hardware, the barbarian tribes.
And that sets the pattern for the next few centuries, which brings us to segment 2. The Roman legions are gone, the Roman roads are crumbling, but the gospel starts moving north and east, carried not by soldiers, but by monks.
Which brings us to the Scots and the Anglo-Saxons, the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries.
The Celtic expansion. This is fascinating because it looks so different from the Roman church model.
How so?
The Roman model was diocesan. It was top-down. Order, structure, boundaries. The Celtic model, led by guys like Columba and Ninian, was monastic and organic. It was decentralized.
The sources call their strategy a cell group model.
That's a good modern term for it.
Mm-hmm.
Columba, for example. He was an Irish monk fruit of Patrick's labor, by the way, who went to Scotland. He set up a monastery on the island of Iona. But it wasn't a retreat center where you went to hide from the world. It was a base of operations, a spiritual boot camp.
So they would go out from there.
They would go out in teams of 12, like the apostles. They would find a pagan settlement, and they wouldn't just stand on a box and yell about sin. They would set up a community next door. They would farm, they would pray, they would run a school, they would take care of the sick, they would demonstrate a different way of being human.
Show, don't just tell.
Right. The local Picts, or Scots, would look at these monks and see that they didn't fight, they shared their food, they treated their women and slaves with dignity. And eventually the pagans would ask, "Why are you like this?" And then, only then, would the monks share the gospel. It was profoundly attractive.
That feels very applicable to today. In a skeptical world, people ignore the preaching, but they can't ignore the lifestyle. The community is the argument.
Grace-filled interaction. That was their secret weapon. But sometimes you need a sledgehammer.
I have a feeling we're talking about Boniface.
We are talking about Boniface. If Columba was the gentle neighbor who wins you over with kindness, Boniface was the special forces operator who blows up the enemy ammo dump.
Set the scene for us. It's the 8th century, Germany.
Right. Boniface is an English missionary named Winfrith, but the Pope renames him Boniface, doer of good. He goes to the Germanic tribes in Hesse. These people were deep into Norse mythology. Thor, Odin, blood sacrifice. They were terrified of the spirits in the forest. Their whole lives were governed by fear.
And there was a specific tree.
The Oak of Thor at Geismar. This was a massive ancient oak tree. The people believed it was the dwelling place of the god of thunder. They would perform sacrifices there, even human sacrifices. They thought if you touched it, you'd be struck dead by lightning.
So Boniface decides to do some landscaping.
He announces he's going to cut it down. A massive crowd gathers, probably waiting to watch this crazy foreigner get fried by a lightning bolt. Boniface walks up, takes an axe, and takes a single swing.
The tension must have been insane.
Can you imagine? Thwack! Silence! No lightning! He keeps chopping. Eventually, the story goes, a great wind blows, which the biographer attributes to God, and the tree comes crashing down, splitting into 4 perfect pieces.
And the crowd.
They gasped, and then they realized Thor wasn't real, or at least he wasn't as strong as Boniface's god. It was what missiologists call a power encounter. Boniface broke the spell of fear that had held them captive for centuries.
And then he did something really practical with the wood, right?
This is the genius part. He used the planks from the idol to build a chapel dedicated to St. Peter right on the spot.
That is the ultimate flex.
It is, but it's also deeply symbolic. He took the materials of their old culture, the wood, and repurposed it for Christ. He didn't just destroy, he rebuilt. And that is the story of the Dark Ages, rebuilding out of the rubble. It's the daily work of taking what's broken in our world and using it to build something that honors God.
Now, while Boniface is chopping trees in Germany, the sources mention something that completely blew my mind. We're so focused on Europe, but apparently there is a stone tablet in China from this same time period.
The Sigenfu stone, yes. This is one of the most exciting archaeological finds for church history, period. It was dug up by accident in the 1600s, but it was carved in 781 AD.
781 AD. So
Yeah.
Charlemagne has just come into power in Europe, and there are established Christian communities in China.
Not just a few. The stone is a massive monument. It records that a missionary named Alepan arrived in the capital of China in 635 AD, 635. That's only a few decades after Gregory the Great sent missionaries to England.
That flips the whole map. I always think of global missions as a 19th century thing.
Yeah.
You know, guys in pith helmets on steamships.
That's the Victorian narrative we've inherited. But the reality is, the church was global from the very early stages. The stone calls Christianity the luminous religion. It says the Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty welcomed Alepan, had him translate the scriptures in the imperial library, and issued an edict allowing the faith to spread.
The luminous religion. I love that.
It describes the theology beautifully. It talks about the triune one and how the Messiah suspended the luminous sun to destroy the realm of darkness. It shows that even while Europe was struggling through what we call the Dark Ages, the light was traveling the Silk Road to the Pacific Ocean.
It's a good reminder that God isn't a Western God.
Never has been. And seeing that global scope really encourages me. It reminds me that God's plan is always bigger than our little corner of the map, and he's always working in places we don't expect.
Okay, so we've got expansion. Ireland, Germany, China. The light is spreading. But as any organization grows, problems start to creep in. And the sources point out that as the church gained institutional power, it started to lose its way spiritually.
The classic tension, institutional power versus spiritual drift. This brings us to segment 3. And you really see this in the figure of Gregory the Great in the late 6th and early 7th centuries.
He's called the Great for a reason.
Yes. He was a brilliant man, a fantastic administrator. He became pope in 590 AD. At that time, Rome was literally falling apart again. Floods, plague, famine. The civil government had totally collapsed. So Gregory, the bishop, stepped up. He organized the food distribution from the church's estates. He paid the soldiers. He negotiated peace treaties with the invading Lombards.
He filled the vacuum. He basically became the civil mayor of Rome.
He saved the city. But in doing so, he concentrated massive political and temporal power in the papacy. And theologically, this is where we start to see things that make Protestants in particular uncomfortable. Well, to manage this massive influx of people who were essentially half-pagan, the church started adapting. Gregory solidified the idea of purgatory. He promoted the veneration of relics and saints. The idea was to give people tangible connection points to faith, but it ended up obscuring the simple gospel of grace.
So it's a double-edged sword, great organizational leadership, but the theology started to get murky.
Exactly. It became a form of godliness without power, as Paul says. You had entire nations, like the Anglo-Saxons in England, being baptized en masse after their king converted. But did they really know Jesus? Or were they just joining the new winning team? It's the birth of nominal Christianity on a massive scale.
And while the church is dealing with this internal drift, a massive external threat rises in the 7th century: Islam.
You cannot tell the story of the Middle Ages without the rise of Islam. It was explosive. Muhammad claims to receive visions in 610 AD. By 732, 100 years later, his followers have conquered everything from India to Spain.
That is incredibly fast.
It's the fastest expansion of a religion in history. And for the church, it was terrifying. The great historical centers of Christianity, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Augustine's own Carthage, were all suddenly under Islamic rule. The Christian world was cut in half.
And the theology was a direct challenge, wasn't it?
A direct challenge. Islam means submission. It presented a God of absolute unknowable will, where salvation is earned through submission and works. It was a stark contrast to the Christian message of a God of relational love who sacrifices himself for us out of grace.
And this leads, eventually, to the Crusades.
It does. But we have to fast forward several centuries to 1095. The Byzantine emperor is threatened by the Seljuk Turks and asks the Pope for help. And Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade.
Now, most people know the Crusades as a dark stain on church history. The sources seem to agree.
It's very complicated, but yes. The stated goal was to protect pilgrims and reclaim the Holy Land. But if we analyze it through the lens of the Great Commission, go and make disciples, it was a complete and utter disaster.
It feels like a distraction, a huge one.
It was a massive distraction. You had the church focusing on claiming land rather than proclaiming the gospel. The sword replaced the cross. The whole motivation was twisted. And you can't force conversion with the sword.
And the result wasn't a converted Middle East.
No. It created deep animosity and centuries of bloodshed that still echoes today. It did bring some cultural changes to Europe, trade, new goods, rediscovered knowledge, but spiritually, it was a low point. It shows what happens when the city of God tries to act like the city of man and use earthly power and violence to advance the kingdom.
And if that wasn't enough, the church splits in half right in the middle of all this in 1054, the Great Schism.
East versus West, Constantinople versus Rome.
The sources mentioned the iconoclastic controversy. This seems like a weird thing to split a church over paintings.
It seems trivial to us, but it was deep. It was about the very nature of worship and the incarnation. In the East, they used icons, holy images of Christ and the saints in worship. They saw them as windows to heaven. In the West, they became suspicious that this was idolatry, a violation of the second commandment.
The line between venerating an image and worshiping it is pretty thin.
Very thin. And the West said, you're crossing the line. The East said, you don't understand the incarnation. God became visible so we can paint him.
And then politics got involved.
Always. The real issue was power. Who is the boss? The Pope in Rome or the Patriarch in Constantinople? In 1054, they excommunicated each other. The seamless robe of Christ was torn in two.
So by the year 1100, things look grim. You've got a split church, a distracted church fighting wars, and corruption seeping in everywhere. It feels like the light is flickering out.
But, and this is the constant theme of our deep dive today, the light doesn't go out. When the institution gets corrupt, the spirit often moves in the margins to bring reform. This brings us to segment 4, the reformers of the heart.
The monastics and the mendicants.
We see a cycle repeated over and over in the Middle Ages. A monastery starts with high ideals, poverty, prayer, service, laid out in Benedict's rule. It gains respect. People see their holiness, so they donate land and money. The monastery becomes wealthy. The monks get lazy and corrupt. And then a new reformer rises up to say, back to the basics.
Like the Cluny reform.
Yes, in the 10th century, they tried to clean house, and then later the Cistercians with Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard is a fascinating figure. He was a mystic, deeply focused on the love of God. He preached that God is known so far as he is loved, a reaction against a church that was becoming all about rules and power.
But the biggest shaker-upper has to be Francis of Assisi.
Francis, the man who married Lady Poverty, probably one of the most beloved figures in all of history, Christian or not.
The story of him stripping off his clothes in the town square, we have to tell that.
It's legendary for a reason. Francis is a rich merchant's son in the late 12th century. He's a party animal, wants to be a knight, spending his dad's money. Then he has a spiritual awakening. He hears God say, Francis, repair my church, which you see is in ruins.
He thought God meant the literal building, right? The little chapel of San Damiano.
At first, yes. He starts stealing his dad's expensive fabric to sell it and fix the chapel. His dad is furious. He drags Francis before the bishop to disown him publicly.
And Francis doesn't just take it.
No. In the town square, in front of everyone, Francis strips naked. He hands his expensive clothes to his father and says, until today I called you Father on earth. Now I can say honestly, our Father who art in heaven.
That is a mic drop moment.
It was a radical rejection of the city of man, money, status, family, honor, comfort. And he starts a new kind of order, the mendicants, begging friars.
How is this different from the old monks?
The old Benedictine monks stayed in the monastery. They were cloistered. The mendicants went to the people. They went to the growing towns, the marketplaces. They lived in radical poverty among the poor, preaching the simple gospel. It was a huge shift.
There's that story about him and the Sultan during the Crusades.
Yes. It's an incredible contrast. While the Crusader armies are trying to kill Muslims, Francis walks across enemy lines during the Fifth Crusade. He gets captured, beaten, and brought before the Sultan of Egypt.
And he preaches to him.
He preaches. He doesn't attack Islam. He just shares the love and peace of Christ. The Sultan was so impressed by his courage and his humility that he listened. He didn't convert, but he sent Francis back safely with his respect. It shows a completely different heart, the heart of Christ in the middle of a war zone.
That challenges me. It's so easy to criticize the culture or the enemy. But do we have the guts to walk across the line and love them?
Exactly. And while Francis was doing that, there was another guy, Peter Waldo, who was doing something even more dangerous.
Waldo, the merchant of Lyon.
Another wealthy guy who gave it all away after hearing a traveling singer tell the story of a saint who lived in poverty. But Waldo's passion wasn't just poverty, it was the Bible. He paid to have the Gospels translated into the vernacular French so the common people could read and understand it.
Which was a big no-no back then.
A huge no-no. The church hierarchy wanted to control the interpretation. They said the common people are too simple, they'll get it wrong. Waldo said, they need the word. He and his followers, the poor men of Lyon, went out preaching 2 by 2, just like in the Gospels.
And they got persecuted for it.
Severely. They were declared heretics, but they kept the light of the scriptures alive among the common people. They were planting seeds that would bloom in a huge way later in the Reformation.
So we have the activists, the doers like Francis and Waldo, but the Middle Ages also produced some massive intellects. This brings us to segment 5, the life of the mind and the soul.
This is where we really definitively debunk the idea that the Middle Ages were stupid. The scholastics were rigorously intellectual. Their motto was faith-seeking understanding.
Let's talk about Anselm.
Anselm of Canterbury, 11th century. He famously said, "I do not seek to understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand."
That sounds backward to modern ears.
Well,
We usually say, prove it to me and then I'll believe.
Right. But Anselm argued that until you step into the circle of faith, you can't see the landscape clearly. Faith isn't a blind leap. It's the lens that lets you see reason correctly. He's famous for the ontological argument for God's existence.
Which is pretty heavy philosophy.
It is. But basically, he's using pure logic to argue that God must exist by definition, that the very concept of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived necessitates his existence. It shows that they weren't afraid of reason. They believed God gave us brains and expects us to use them.
But the heavyweight champion of scholasticism is Thomas Aquinas.
The dumb ox.
Why'd they call him that?
Because he was a big, quiet, slow-moving guy. His family actually kidnapped him and locked him in a tower for a year to try to stop him from joining the Dominican order. His classmates teased him, but his teacher, Albertus Magnus, famously said, "You call him a dumb ox, but I tell you, this ox's bellow will be heard around the world."
And he was right. Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica.
A massive work, millions of words. Aquinas' great project was to integrate the philosophy of Aristotle, which is being rediscovered in the West through Arab scholars, with Christian theology. He argued that reason and faith are not enemies. They are two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth.
He has those 5 ways to prove God exists, right?
Yeah.
The unmoved mover, the first cause.
Exactly. He's using logic and observation of the natural world to show that the universe requires a creator. But, and I love this detail, after writing all these millions of words, all this brilliant logic, he has a mystical experience during the Lord's Supper near the end of his life.
And he stops writing.
He stops completely. His friend urges him to finish the Summa. And Aquinas famously says, "All that I have written seems to me nothing but straw compared to what I have seen and what has been revealed to me."
Wow. The greatest intellect of the age, realizing that God is bigger than his brain.
It's a beautiful humility. It reminds us that while we should study and learn and think deeply, ultimately, God is a person to be known and experienced, not just a concept to be analyzed.
That leads us perfectly to the mystics. Because while the scholastics were using their heads, the mystics were engaging the heart. A reaction, maybe?
A necessary balance, I think. People like Hildegard of Bingen and Catherine of Siena.
Hildegard was a powerhouse. A composer, a visionary, a writer, a naturalist.
She was a Renaissance woman before the Renaissance. And Catherine of Siena. Talk about courage. She famously rebuked the Pope.
This was during the Babylonian captivity, right? When the popes had moved from Rome to Avignon, France.
Right. The papacy had moved to France, and it was basically under the thumb of the French king. It was a massive scandal. Rome was abandoned. Catherine, a young woman with no official title, writes to Pope Gregory XI and basically tells him to man up. She says, "Be a man and go back to your post in Rome."
That takes some serious guts.
It does, and he listened. He moved the papacy back to Rome, partly because of her influence. It shows that even in a male-dominated hierarchy, God used women with profound spiritual authority to steer the ship.
That brings us to our final segment, the pre-dawn, the 14th and 15th centuries. The structures are really cracking now.
The Babylonian captivity in Avignon was bad, but then it got worse. The Great Schism of the papacy. Not east-west this time, but west-west.
2 popes.
At one point 3, one in Rome, one in Avignon, one in Pisa, all claiming to be the vicar of Christ, all excommunicating the others and their followers. The church became an object of ridicule and satire.
Imagine the confusion for the average believer. Who do I follow?
Exactly. The credibility of the institution was at rock bottom. And into this mess stepped the men we call the forerunners of the Reformation. John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia.
Wycliffe is often called the morning star of the Reformation.
He was an Oxford professor, and he looked at the chaos of the popes and said, "This is fundamentally wrong."
What was his solution?
He went back to the source of authority. He said the Pope is not the head of the church, Christ is, and the ultimate authority for the Christian life is not the Pope's decrees, but Scripture. Sola Scriptura, before Luther.
So he translates the Bible into English.
From the Latin Vulgate. Yes, he wanted the common plowboy to know the Bible better than the Pope did. His followers, the Lollards, spread these handwritten copies and his teachings underground. He was a revolutionary.
And Jan Hus took those ideas to Prague.
Hus was a Bohemian priest and the rector of the University of Prague. He read Wycliffe. He preached against indulgences. the practice of selling forgiveness for money. He preached against the corruption of the clergy. He became a hero to the Bohemian people.
But the empire struck back.
They called him to the Council of Constance under a promise of safe conduct. Come and explain yourself, we won't hurt you.
Which was a lie.
It was a trap. They arrested him, put him on a sham trial, and burned him at the stake in 1415.
That is heavy. But the cat was out of the bag. You couldn't kill the idea.
No. As he was dying, tradition says he prophesied, "You may cook this goose." Hus means goose in Czech. But in 100 years, a swan will rise that you cannot silence. 102 years later, Martin Luther, who had a swan on his family, crest-nailed his theses to the door.
And then you have Erasmus, the Renaissance scholar. He wasn't a revolutionary like Huss, but he did something crucial.
In 1516, he published the Greek New Testament. For the first time, he put the original source text into the hands of scholars all over Europe.
Going back to the original source.
Exactly. Before this, they were relying on the Latin translation, which had some key errors. Erasmus put the actual Greek text in the hands of scholars, and as the saying goes, Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched.
Because once Luther read the Greek, he saw that the Latin do penance was actually the Greek repent, which means to change your mind. And boom, the Reformation begins.
And that ends our 1,000-year journey through the so-called Dark Ages.
So let's synthesize this. We started by saying the Dark Ages is a myth. Looking back, what have we seen?
We've seen that God is not limited by human chaos. When Rome fell, God raised up Augustine to give us a theology of the city of God. When the church became institutional and cold, God raised up Francis and the mystics to warm its heart. When the mind was neglected, he gave us Anselm and Aquinas. When the leadership was corrupt, he gave us Wycliffe and Huss.
It seems like God works through, well, everyone, from all different angles.
He works through outsiders, Patrick the slave. He works through intellectuals, Aquinas. He works through radicals, Waldo. He works through women, Catherine. He preserves his church. Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." The Middle Ages are a 1,000-year proof of that promise.
That brings us to our final thought for you, the listener.
Here is the challenge that these sources leave us with. If these believers living in a time of plague, no antibiotics, rampant violence, and deep institutional corruption could produce such blinding lights of faith, what is our excuse?
Oof. Yeah. We complain about traffic and bad Wi-Fi.
Exactly. So the question for us today is this. Are we building a city of man, focusing on our comfort, our politics, our temporary safety nets? Or are we, in our daily, small, faithful lives, contributing to the city of God? Are we willing to be like Boniface and chop down the idols in our culture? Are we willing to be like Patrick and go back to the people who hurt us with the gospel?
That's the question. The Dark Ages weren't dark because God was absent. They were dark because the world is broken. But the light of the faithful shined all the brighter because of the contrast.
Exactly. And that light is still shining. The question is, are we hiding it under a bowl or are we putting it on a stand?
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for traveling through history with us. We'll see you next time.